Hello, Mr. Robert. Welcome.
Thank you.
And thank you so much for agreeing to do this oral history project. I would like to start from the early beginnings.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering if you can please tell me where were you born and where did you grow up?
I was born in Sussex, south of London, just before the war, and I grew up there. My first years were the years of the war, Second World War. So.
And you grew up in Sussex?
Yes.
Do you recall any memorable moments from your childhood?
Well, it was the war years. I suppose one and some of the most memorable moments are associated with that. Bombing raids going out, drone of aeroplanes, V-1s and V-2 rockets coming in with the engines cutting out, wondering where they were going to land, things of that nature.
Yeah. What about your parents? What did they do, and what was the most valuable thing you learned from them?
That would take a project on its own, wouldn't it? My father was a bank manager, though, again, being the war, he joined the army and was away for much of that time, but then came back and remained in that career. My mother was a mother, full-time mother. What did they give me? They gave me all sorts of things. I suppose a love of books is something that has particularly influenced my life since.
Okay. Moving to your schooling years, what was your favorite subject at school?
I had quite an inspirational teacher of history when I got to the stage, age 15, of doing my A-levels. And so I think that was the subject that I enjoyed most and got most out of.
So you were always interested in history and learning about different cultures?
Yes, yes.
Let us now move to your years at Oxford.
Mm-hmm.
I would really like to know, what did you read at Oxford?
Well, I then went on and read modern history at Oxford, which in those days the course largely meant that over the 3 years you gradually worked your way through history from Britain at the end of the Roman period down to the First World War. But I also had a chance to do a special subject which excuse me, gave me the first opportunity to branch outside Europe, and I did a paper on the period of Warren Hastings in British India at the end of the 18th century.
That's interesting. And was that your choice, what you read in Oxford, or did anyone influence you to choose that?
Well, my teachers at school, and history was my main subject, so it was a fairly natural option. And I don't think I ever really doubted that that was the direction I would go.
Tell me about your experience at Oxford. What are some of the most memorable moments there?
Some memorable moments, but again, they're always, student years always tend to leave lots of memories, some of which you want to recall and some of which you don't. One of the things that I did was I got involved in the student newspaper, which is called Charwell, which still exists, I think, and worked with a couple of the editors there, both of whom went on to be eminent national journalists in their own right.
Oh, wow. Career-wise, did you know that you wanted to pick a path in diplomacy, and did you know exactly what you wanted to do at that time, or were you a bit unsure?
The way it worked is the government, being the government, it had the most long-winded recruitment process of all the various options that were available. And my tutor said at the beginning of my last year, well, whether you're decided on the government or not, if you want to keep that option, you have to start now, filling up the forms and going through various tests and interviews and so on. And being slightly lazy, having started on the process, it didn't seem to be much point in duplicating it by applying for other things at the same time. And when at the end of this rather protracted steeplechase I sort of ended up on my feet and they said, yes, you can have a job if you want, I said yes. So it was not a very conscious, inspired choice. It was something I always thought would be interesting and was worth seeing if they would have me, and they did.
Okay. Before focusing on your time in Oman as the British ambassador between 1986 and 1990, I would really like to know more about the years leading up to that.
Well, I joined the Foreign Office in 1961. And for the first year, they sent me to the School of Oriental and African Studies to do an intensive course in Farsi, Persian. And I went after that to Iran and then on to Afghanistan. So that was my first spell abroad. I then came back to Britain, had a spell in France. We went, my wife and I, by that time I was married, we went back to Iran in the mid-1970s, the latter years of the Shah's rule, but before the period of the actual revolution. And I then rather moved into defence-related work in the Foreign Office in a series of jobs, both in London and at NATO. So the years immediately before I went to Muscat had been focused rather on that. And I have to say I was rather surprised to be appointed to Muscat, because I think I remained the only British ambassador in the whole period since 1970, when the first ambassador was appointed, not to have been an Arabic speaker. But I think I was there precisely because I was a Persian speaker. And this was the period in the years after the revolution in Iran, when both regional governments and the British government were trying to come to terms with the religious regime in Iran and what it meant, and also to sort out whether the mullahs' Iran or Saddam Hussein's Iraq was the greater destabilizing force in the region. And I think it was partly a conscious decision, therefore, to appoint some people who had some knowledge and background about Iran to some of the posts around Iran. Oman, of course, has a strong relationship with Iran, and I'm pretty sure it was a deliberate choice, and probably one approved by the Sultan, to have somebody who was not an Arabic speaker but did know about his important neighbour.
Yeah. And why you went back to Iran with your wife?
I went back to Iran. This is pre-revolution.
Yes.
I didn't serve there after the revolution in 1979, but it was that was 1974 to 77.
Yeah. Can you tell me more about that period and your experience in Iran during your time there?
Well, I mean, nominally, the British government and the American government had very close relationship with the Shah and the Shah's Iran. There was at that time a much smaller body, but not dissimilarly structured to NATO, called CENTO, which comprised of Turkey, Iran, Pakistan, Britain and America, and was a military alliance as part of the Cold War structures, if you like. So, as I say, nominally we had a very close relationship with the Shah. My ambassador saw the Shah regularly, talked to him a lot. The Iranians, they weren't easy partners, even then. And then this was the period in which the internal instability, built largely around the activities of Ayatollah Khomeini, were just beginning to develop. And in the last year or so that I was there, we were beginning in the embassy to ask ourselves the question, are these just inconsequential pressures, or do they represent a real threat to the stability of the Shah's regime? And that was quite a lively debate between us on the ground and people in London, including Ivor Lucas, who was also a chairman of the Society, who was the head of the geographical department in the Foreign Office that dealt with Iran at the time. And of course, it proved that it was an existential threat to that regime.
Yeah. Okay, going to Oman now. Do you remember the day you arrived in Oman, and what were your first impressions about the country and the people?
The heat. It was the end of June, and the plane arrived about midnight, and the plane doors opened, and this incredible heat surged in. And by the time we'd been greeted and got to the hotel, I felt I was almost suffering from heat exhaustion.
And what about the people? What are your impressions on the Omani people?
Oh, well, very, very positive. I mean, professionally, one had agreements and disagreements when one was discussing questions with the foreign ministry and other officials, but people were always charming and friendly, both in the Muscat area and when we had the opportunity to travel. And I think that's the overwhelming impression of almost everybody who visits or lives or works in Oman.
What are your views on the role of an ambassador, and what did your job involve? Well,
again, that could be a subject for a longish tutorial, couldn't it? I mean, an ambassador has the overall direction of an embassy, and that embassy does various things. It monitors the local political scene, it promotes British trade, it offers consular services to British people who live or are visiting the country. It has an information program, publicity program about Britain and British policy. Working with the British Council, it promotes cultural links and so on. So the nature of the ambassador's job is to try to pull all of those strands together into a coherent policy and to maintain the links with the senior local politicians, in the case of Oman, principally the Sultan, followed by the Foreign Minister, Yusuf bin Alawi, who was doing the job when I arrived in 1986 and is still doing it in 2018, and other senior Omani ministers and military leaders and so on.
What did you hope to achieve during your posting in Oman?
I suppose to sustain and, where possible, expand what was already a close relationship both between the governments and, more broadly, between other British institutions and their Omani opposite numbers.
What are the advantages and the disadvantages of being an ambassador abroad? Can you please tell me more about some of the challenges you faced?
Well, that's two questions in one, isn't it? Being an ambassador is to be a privileged observer, I think, of the country that you're in, because you're close to the political process of that country, and you think of the role, talking in July 2018, the role of the EU countries and embassies in monitoring all that's going on in the British political process. So, as I say, you're in a privileged position because you meet the senior leaders of the country, in the course of your primary job, which is to represent the views of your government at home, whatever they may be. Just repeat the second part of the question.
What are the disadvantages of being...
Disadvantages of being ambassador? No, I don't think there are disadvantages. Posts are more or less rewarding, really according to the state of political relations between the countries, which in Oman's case were extremely close. Therefore, it wasn't a post which presented huge challenges. It was, as I say, to maintain and, where possible, improve an existing very close relationship. You contrast that, for example, again in July 2018 with the role of the British Embassy in Moscow, with whom we have the most profound range of disagreements, and that in turn presents a whole series of challenges to the ambassador and his team in their work.
And personally, do you think there was any language barriers?
No, very interesting. A good question. I mean, it did mean that I was dependent on other people in my team, and I did have Arabic language speakers in the embassy, to mix with and sense the opinions of the very many Omanis who don't speak English, but I mean, from soon after 1970, one of the strengths of Oman has been that English is very strong in its curriculum. The number of Omanis who speak very good English is high, and the higher you go up the political and business structures, the greater it is. So I never felt that it was actually an inhibition to do business. I once did a little sort of rain check. I mean, the Council of Ministers, I think if I remember rightly, had 16 members, of whom 14 were very happy to do business in English, and the other 2 I didn't really have any business with. So the number of occasions when I really had to rely on an interpreter, for example, were very few. And the Sultan, having been educated here and at Sandhurst and so on, speaks immaculate English. So the dialogue with him, for me and for visitors coming from Britain, was very easy in that sense.
The current site of the residence to Her Majesty's Ambassador to Oman is situated on the coast to the south of Muscat with an absolutely breathtaking views over the Arabian Sea. I was wondering, is that the place where you stayed during your time in Oman?
No. We, successive generations of British government appointees, political residents, political agents, consular representatives, and then the earlier ambassadors, until the mid-1990s, all occupied a building in Muscat Bay, next to the Sultan's palace there, which was a mid-19th century building, one of the relatively very few major or substantial buildings in Old Muscat, with a view which was, if anything, even more spectacular than the present embassy, because we looked out across Muscat Bay, where there was this tradition that over the centuries people had come and painted the names of ships that come to visit on the rocks, and a big Portuguese fort on either side of the bay. So it was absolutely a magical location. There was already an indication that as part of a general move of embassies and government out of Old Muscat into different parts of the capital area, at some stage the Omanis were keen that the location of the embassy should be addressed. I knew really that while Mrs. Thatcher was Prime Minister and she was an enthusiast for this building, it was unlikely to come to a head, and I was correct. A year or so after I left, she left office, and the discussion about a move got underway seriously when Terry Clark, who was my successor, was ambassador, and in turn the actual move to the existing residence and embassy, Chancery building, took place when Richard Muir arrived 4 or 5 years later.
Did Her Majesty ever visit you there?
Not while I was there. She had made a state visit to Oman. I'm trying to remember then. I remember exactly when it was. 1979 comes to mind, and Sultan had made a state visit here. There were quite regular informal contacts between Sultan and the Queen when the Sultan, who has a couple of residences in Britain, was in the country. And I went on one occasion to a lunch at his house in Wargrave in Berkshire when he entertained Mrs. Thatcher. But he would quite often lunch with the Queen when he was here as well. And we had, and then other members of the royal family came to visit in my time. The major one, which happened to be very early on, was by the Prince of Wales and the Princess of Wales in the summer of 1986, which was a time when they were still able to use HMS Britannia as a sort of floating base for a regional tour of that kind.
Yeah. I would like to know about the impact that moving to Oman had on your family. Did your children adapt fairly well to the new environment?
Well, in those days, the assumption really was that because British primary school education was available in most places, but there were at that time not many places where British secondary school educations were available, particularly outside Europe. And so the assumption rather was that children went to boarding school when they were 9. And so it became a matter of that their education wasn't in Oman. They came for school holidays. And so for them, it was a largely holiday environment and one that they thoroughly enjoyed. And as a result, both our children have spent substantial periods of their adult lives back in Oman and neighbouring countries.
So, do you believe that the diplomatic lifestyle influenced their career choices later in life?
Not really, no. I mean, it's influenced where they've been happy to live, but not particularly what they're doing. Neither of them ever really seriously considered joining the Foreign Office. Son, having done an MBA, has worked mainly in lots of time in the tourism and sporting area in Oman and the UAE. And our daughter had 2 spells back in that part of the world because her husband was an international lawyer and worked there. So they've got many memories of the area, but it hasn't really governed what they've actually done.
Okay. You arrived in Oman the same year Sultan Qaboos University opened.
Yes.
Do you remember that, or did you attend the official opening?
No, I don't think I did attend the initial opening, and I don't quite remember exactly how it all came about. I think it was rather phased in and opened sort of faculty by faculty. There must have been a ceremony, but I suspect that was just slightly before we arrived, because the new university campus was just completed and faculties were being developed and expanded. Relationship with the Vice-Chancellor, the first Vice-Chancellor, Sheikh Amor, was a close one, and he had quite a number of British academics working for him in various faculties. And by the time we left 3 years later, I think probably was the year that the first batch of students graduated.
And what was your daily routine like in Oman? And what were your leisure activities there?
Well, to correspond with Omani sort of government hours, we worked a long single spell day with no lunch break. So we used to work, if I remember rightly, 7:30 to 1:30 with no break. And that was roughly the government office hours as well. Well, leisure was a pretty relative term, except at weekends when we would get out of town if we could, certainly in the cooler months. I mean, the social life, particularly for an ambassador, was very intense. So the number of days when we didn't have at least one, if not more, social events to attend in the evening, probably not more than one a month, as it were. So, as I say, leisure was a relative term, even if not a huge amount of the time was necessarily spent at the office desk, because that was all the social life is part of the representational activity of an ambassador and an embassy.
Did you enjoy the social life?
Yes. No, and that's really the way we got to know many more Omanis much better than through dealing with them formally in their offices.
Yeah. Can you please provide a summary of the British-Omani relationship during your time there?
Well, I think just to focus on the period of Sultan Qaboos's rule from 1970, it's always been extremely close. He had been educated in Britain. When he came to the throne, his country was in the middle of a war in Dhofar, in which they were threatened by Marxist-inspired rebels from across the border in South Yemen, and he was very dependent on the help that he got from Britain and from Iran and Jordan in that, and that established, I think, a close working relationship, which in a sense also he inherited from his father's reign, because under Sultan Saeed, in a sense, Oman only had foreign relations with Britain, nobody else, and there were no other embassies, with a small exception of an Indian mission. So it was a very close working relationship. And it was important from the British side. We tended to see things through the same eyes, and we respected his judgments. For example, he regarded Saddam Hussein as a much greater threat than Iran. And we, for our part, Britain, for its part, having in 1970 turned its back on what was called East of Suez, the Labour government of the day took a decision not to have British forces based east of Suez anymore. By the end of the decade, by the end of the 80s, a Conservative government, Mrs Thatcher's government, with Michael Heseltine as Defence Secretary, was quite keen to demonstrate that we could project military force east of Suez, and the first of a series of Safe Sharia exercises which involved land, air and naval forces from Britain deploying to Oman and exercising with their Omani counterparts took place in 1986. There was another one in the mid-90s, and there's another one in the autumn of 2018 being planned as we speak.
Can you tell me more about the Omani British Friendship Association?
Yes. I thought there was a subordinate question coming up, which was, have the relations got closer
nowadays
since my time? And I think the answer to that, shortly, is more of the same. I mean, they are extremely close. Strong emphasis on military and security, intelligence relationships, political relationship with the Sultan, very close. These days, I think he doesn't see very many foreign visitors except at head of government or head of state level, but he quite regularly talks to people from here, from Britain. There is, as I was saying, another Safe Sharia exercise planned for the autumn of 2018. So I don't think it's changed in its nature. but it is certainly as strong as it was.
What about the Omani British Friendship Association?
Well, I talked a bit earlier about the various functions of an embassy. When I arrived, I felt that we lacked a body that would act as a sort of focus for developing commercial and business relationships. And something that I discussed with the Sultan, I discussed with senior business figures in London. And out of that emerged the Omani British Friendship Association. Slightly odd name, and there was the reason for it was there was a Oman-Japan Friendship Association headed by a very senior Omani figure who was determined that that should be the Friendship Association should be the model, the name used. And it might more logically have been called Oman British Business Council or something like that. But he got to the Sultan before I did, and that's what we were called. But it was a business-to-business body, chaired by a senior man here, who, if I remember, was a main board director of BP, and from the outset by Maqbool Sultan, who is still doing that job at the Omani end. What are we talking about now? Nearly 30 years later. And the whole idea was that it would have a British component and an Omani component, who would each have maybe a program of their own, but would at least once or twice a year come together to talk about mutual, to talk together about how trade and business links between the two countries could be increased. And in the last couple of years, the British end of what was here called OBFA, Oman British Friendship Association, here as well, has renamed itself the Oman British Business Council.
What about the big cultural 1989 Omani British program?
Oman, yes, that was called Oman with Britain, a name that was a title personally selected by the Sultan to emphasize the relationship in the way that he wanted. And it was both, if you like, a celebration and a promotion. It was designed to enhance the awareness of Omanis of all levels of society about the relationship with Britain, its range, its depth and so on, and at the same time to enhance that range and depth. And so with the help of some commercial sponsorship, we put together a major program across a whole range of areas of activity, from a trade fair to a fashion show to a football team, to various cultural events, musical events, drama. And again, none of which were things that probably could not have happened before, but by making them all happen at the same time, you've got a multiplier effect, and I think it did have an impact. Nobody had done anything on quite this scale in Oman and across that range in Oman before. And I think it certainly it certainly was an investment, if you like, that paid off.
Yeah. In November 1986, Diana, Princess of Wales, visited Jabal Akhtar with Prince Charles, and a platform was built on the site called Diana's Point. I was wondering, did you get to visit it, and what do you think of Jabal Akhtar?
It's funny that because I remember the visit very, very much, and I thought I had accompanied Prince Charles wherever he went. I don't remember going with him to the Jabal Akhtar, actually. It may be that she went as far. I mean, she had a program of her own at times when he was having formal meetings with the Sultan and this and that. There was a separate program organised for her, and it may be that that she did go off. But the answer is I don't remember.
Okay. Can you tell me about your best and worst day in Oman?
Well, best and worst day. I think the visit of the Prince and Princess of Wales was probably, a few days was very much a high point, clearly, because it was a very major visit, and the Omanis Sultan pulled out all the stops in terms of hospitality for them. And one of my most graphic memories really is the because Prince Charles played polo. There was a polo match set up, and the Sultan kept a little polo team, and so there was a polo match, and the halftime music was played by the Royal Oman Police Camel-Mounted Pipe Band, which is an interesting body, and one that I have great attachment for. But at the end of the match, the really memorable event was this, when it was dusk, and this group of camel-mounted bagpipers walked off into the desert playing God Save the Prince of Wales.
What about your worst day, Oman?
My worst day, well, there were days that were more difficult than others. I don't think I had in the sense I never had a tragedy, a plane crash or anything like that, which you tends to sear itself into your memories as a bad experience. But no, I think I'll pass on that.
Okay. What is the best place you've ever been to outside of Muscat in Oman?
Well, I think the Jabal Akhdar is very spectacular. Much of the country is spectacular and mountainous, both in the north around the mountains and in the south in Dhofar. But I think Jabal Akhdar is probably the most memorable, and we have been up. There was a television program recently about a hotel called the Hotel Antara, which is built up on the crest of the Jabal Akhdar, looking back down towards the sea. Which we did get to, but the only way you could get to it at that time was in a helicopter. And you had this sort of fantastic, you'd suddenly appear on the crest of this mountain, 4,000 metres up or something, no, not 4,000 metres, 4,000 feet, with this panoramic view of the whole of the Batna coast and the capital area spread out at your feet.
Yeah.
And so I think that made an impact that probably nowhere else quite achieved. The Wahiba Sands, of course, are also very memorable. So are the turtle beaches near Ras Al Had. So there are many places that one could detail, but I think Jabal Akhdar would come top of the list.
Okay. Can you tell me some of the unexpected encounters you've had there?
Well, I suppose when you travel, you would come across ordinary Omanis, and then bear in mind that the point of development 30 years ago was not nearly as advanced as it is now in terms of modern facilities, electricity, running water, paved roads, and so on. You suddenly would come across Omanis, both Bedou in the desert and villagers, living in a traditional lifestyle that had been unchanged for many centuries. And in terms of juxtaposing the old and the new, on one occasion I was with Prince Michael of Kent, who had been on a previous visit. Somebody had given him a camel, and his way of resolving the dilemma of what to do with it was to ask the person who had given it to him to look after it for him. And when he came back, he remembered this, and he thought, well, he'd better show some interest. And so he said, I'd like to go and see how my camel is getting on. And it was way out in the middle of the Wahiba sands somewhere. But the only way of getting to there in his time frame was actually to land a helicopter where the camel was and the man was looking after it. So we landed in a helicopter and got out of the helicopter and sat under a thorn bush and had a very traditional roast goat with Princess Michael and I given the eyeballs, and the camel was duly inspected and ridden to some discomfort.
What's your favorite thing about Oman?
My
favorite thing about Oman?
We have a great affinity for particular reasons with the Bustan Palace Hotel, which had just been built, partly as a hotel, partly as a conference centre for GCC summits when we arrived. And when we arrived, just before we arrived, I got a message from the deputy to say he was very sorry, but the bathrooms in this oldish embassy building we have, which had been added subsequent to the building itself because there was no running water in the original building, all had woodworm and risked collapsing off the side. They'd been attached to the side of it and they risked collapsing. But there was a hotel up the road which had just been opened, and he recommended that we should spend our first few weeks living there. We could work all right in there, but we just couldn't live there. And so we spent our first 3 months in the Bustan Palace Hotel, huge edifice with about 20 guests in the middle of the summer, and about 200 staff. So I think that was a memorable beginning, and one that's always lived with us, and we try and always go back on a visit when we're there.
What about the Omani cuisine?
Well, I'm never very sure how much of what Omanis eat is characteristically Omani or generically Arab. I mean, we certainly enjoyed it very much, and the way of serving it and so on, where you always mix things rather than having a plate of something deposited in front of you. I always have a soft spot for a dessert called Ali.
Any other favorite traditional dishes that you like?
Not that I recall. No.
Okay.
Very especially.
What lessons did you learn from your time in Oman?
I suppose the most significant one is really to appreciate the powerful, good or evil, in this case exclusively for good, that one leader can have on a whole society, and what Sultan Qaboos has achieved since 1970, albeit he's had the resources from oil revenues to do it, is, it seems to me, a most remarkable example of the leadership of one person, first of all to pull together what, as we were saying, as a result of the Dhofar War and things which preceded it, was a fairly divided society, to pull together and to turn what was the poorest and least developed part of the Arabian Peninsula into what it is now. Is an object lesson in positive leadership.
I would like to know who or what had the most positive influence in your life in general?
Well, I think at this stage, I have to say my wife, don't I? But she clearly has, and insofar as we've been married for 49 years, that the cumulative effect of that is much greater than any other one individual. But there were, as I referred to earlier, teachers, both at school and at university, more senior colleagues in the diplomatic service, people of other nationalities like Omanis whom I worked with, who have had an impact, whom I've liked, from whom I've learned, and who sort of all contribute, I suppose, to my worldview of today, as it were.
And what are some of the accomplishments that you are most proud of?
Well, I think if you have a career in something like diplomacy, it's not like being an actor or a businessman where you can say finitely I made that profit or I was in that show and so on. You're contributing to process all the time. It's more like, if you ask that question of a journalist, I think he would pause or she would pause. Because you're in the position of an observer and an analyst rather than a doer. I'd like to think that I've made a contribution to that process along the way, and since leaving the Foreign Office, I've done a number of more finite activities relating to schools and charities and so on, which I suppose you could call accomplishments, including the chairmanship of the Anglo-Omani Society for the last 4 years. I don't again really naturally describe it as an accomplishment, but it's something I've done and where I hope I might have made a modest contribution.
Yeah. What advice would you give for someone embarking on a similar career path?
Well, I think, first of all, to say that I think diplomacy, even in the age of much greater communication and so on, remains intrinsically fascinating and necessary. The idea that somehow or another foreign ministers can sit and Facebook each other and do all their business that way seems to me to be for the birds. You need people on the ground who understand the country you're dealing with. I suppose the one piece of advice I always do give to young people if I'm having a conversation is really what we were just saying, is if you aspire to be a doer where your accomplishments are clear and finite and you can list them, maybe diplomacy is not going to be that rewarding. If you're interested in being an observer and an analyst and to an extent a historian and trying to get under the skin of nations, other nations, and to interpret what makes them tick and why and how things are happening, then it's fascinating. And it does seem to me that it's more analogous to being a foreign correspondent in one sense than almost anything else.
Is there anything that you want to share in closing? Is there anything we didn't talk about that you would like to add?
No, except to say that in the context of this being part of an oral history project for the Anglo-Omani Society, which I have chaired for the past 4 years, but I'm about to come to an end in that role. I do believe that the Society has a key role to play, working alongside the two governments and other NGOs in ensuring that both at the political level relations remain positive and strong, and that at the human level they constantly expand, and that a generation of Omanis who have grown up in whose personal memories, exclusive those of modern developed Oman, have the same sort of positive view of relations with Britain as their parents, and partly through being able to interact with those who come here as students, and also that this building that we're in Sackville Street, is well used to promote all of those activities, and I sometimes describe it as Beit Oman, and it seems to me it should be that. It's here, of course, to provide a venue for the activities we offer our membership, but it should be as actively used as possible for something much broader as well.
Well, Mr. Alston, thank you so much for this very interesting talk, and on behalf of everybody at the Anglo-Oman Society, thank you so much, and we wish you all the best.
That's very kind. Thank you. And I wish you all the best as you move on to other things as well.